Hey everybody, welcome to the back room. I'm Andy Ostrow. We have a great show for you today. We have Ian Bremmer in the back room. We'll get to Ian shortly, but first, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please rate and review and follow or subscribe, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So here's some feedback we received this week on our conversation with Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson of the Secretary. Barb McQuaid writes, perfect match of the right person for the moment. Elaine Martin of Florida writes, I discovered your podcast this morning because Jocelyn Benson wrote about it on Twitter and left a link to your show. What a fabulous person. I really enjoyed this interview. Thank you for having her as a guest. I will now listen to past episodes. And I wish someone like her was Secretary of State in our horrible state. James Powers writes, I hold Secretary Benson in high regard. Michigan is a lucky state. And just for shameless self-promotion, D. Ironside writes, this is a perfect forum for Andy's talents. although he is a man of many talents. Love the podcast. I am a man of many talents.
Which friend of yours is he?
It is not someone I've known for 30 years, Maddie. I don't know what you're driving at, okay? Shame on you for suggesting that.
Lifetime supply of chocolate.
Thanks, D. All right. We got a lot of stuff to discuss. It was a very busy week, shockingly. We have three big things this week. The first is the election.
What those people did when they violently attacked the Capitol in order to stop a constitutionally mandated meeting of the Congress to accept the results of the Electoral College is a stain on our history, and every one of those sons of who did that, we ought to find them, try them, and send them to jail. And one of the critical mistakes made in this campaign is that Donald Trump has now said, I'm going to pardon those people because they're hostages. No, they're not. They're thugs. I'm a Republican. I don't want to have a Democrat president. I want to have a Republican president. But we're facing as a country a decision, and everybody gets to make it, as to what kind of leadership we're going to have. And to me, it is a mistake on the part of the Trump campaign to allow the president's impulses to identify himself with the people who assaulted the Capitol rather than people who stand for law and order.
Yeah. So that was Karl Rove, Bush's brain.
Turd blossom.
You stole my joke, Maddie. So Karl Rove obviously is talking about Donald Trump and his referencing of the January 6th rioters as hostages and patriots, as well as the promise to pardon them should he become president again. And so when you lose Turd Blossom, it's kind of over, in my opinion. Big news, no labels. After much bedwetting, Democrats can rejoice because No Labels announced that it will not be putting up a third-party candidate.
And this is only, about a week after their co-founder died, Joe Lieberman, who I have absolutely no love for and I thought was a terrible person. But
they can't get anyone.
Well, yeah, I mean, because everyone that they were thinking of actually does not want Trump to win. So they wanted Chris Christie, and Chris Christie said, if this helps Donald Trump, I'm out.
Yeah, well, they looked at Christie, they looked at Joe Manchin, they looked at Larry Hogan, and you're right. Nobody wants to get in the middle of this shit show. Also, interestingly, the polls, new polls have been out this week. Morning Consult, Wall Street Journal, Economist. Biden's inching up. It's gaining ground. Things are starting to settle. Voters don't typically focus too much on the election until Labor Day, but, obviously people might be starting to focus a little bit sooner this year. Certainly his State of the Union speech, which was amazing, probably helped. But, there was an interesting poll that the Journal put out, and this speaks to the toxic tribalism in politics today. When they asked people in certain states, swing states, like, how are you feeling about your state's economy? They all said it's great. And then when they asked the next question of, what do you think about the national economy? Oh, it's horrible, bad shape. I mean, look, this morning, 303,000 new jobs created in March. Unemployment rate ticked down from 3.9% to 3.8%. The economy continues to be on fire. It is the greatest economy in decades. So for people to say their state economy is doing great, but we're in trouble on the national level, what's the United States of America? We have 50 independent states, if they're all doing well with the economy, then that means, folks, that the national economy is doing really well.
Yeah, but that's consistent with the way people feel about politicians. Also, they like their local politician, but they hate the government as a whole.
But you can't say the economy's not doing well just because you don't like Joe Biden. There are facts. There are leading economic indicators that we in this country have used since the beginning of time to measure the economy. The economy is doing incredibly well.
Well, the DNC has to do a better job.
Sure, it's partially a messaging problem. All right, let's get to my favorite subject, Trumpy
What?
McTrumpster.
What is it? What is your favorite
It's
subject?
Trump, Jen. Come on, you know that. So he had some major losses this week in 3 different jurisdictions, New York, Florida, and Georgia. Judges in each of those cases denied his motions to dismiss his cases based on everything from immunity to violation of free speech rights, blah, blah, blah. It's all bullshit. He has no defense. His only defense is delay and kick the can down the road and hopefully become president again and shut down these cases. So in each of these cases, the judges said no. There were some more interesting things going on in Florida because Judge Cannon is in his pocket. But the ruling in Florida that Judge Cannon made in response to what Special Counsel Jack Smith had requested, which was basically some kind of like declaratory judgment to say either she's going to move forward with these jury instructions that everybody's up in arms about the Presidential Records Act, or she's not. And if she's not, then it's done. And if she is, he can file an appeal. So what did she do? She said, nope, I'm not going to make either decision. What do you think of that? So now what does Jack Smith do? Brings back Jen's favorite term, the writ of mandamus.
It's like you can read my mind.
He's probably going to have to do it.
Sure. Yeah. The writ of mandamus is basically, he's going to have to appeal to the 11th Circuit to say she's awful, she's incompetent, and the law that she's applying to this case does not apply. Trump is being brought up on charges violating the Espionage Act. The Presidential Records Act is a civil thing. Not only is not what he's been charged with violating, but if he was charged with violating that, that's for the civil courts. So she's bringing in something that has no place in the criminal court system. So if he files a writ of mandamus, which is basically, a nuclear option, right? He goes to the 11th Circuit and he makes an appeal to have her removed.
Or move the jurisdiction to a different judge.
Right. And look, the 11th Circuit's knocked her down twice before for bad rulings. So it's very likely that if he makes that move, that's what would happen again. But it's just crazy. She is so in over her head.
Well, yes, she is in over her head, but basically she's accomplished what she has clearly wanted to do, which is make sure that this case does not move forward until the election is over. And that seems to be every legal expert's expectation based on the timing. She's wasted more than 30 days on incredibly simple decisions. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, I'm reserving my judgment whether or not she's like purposefully delaying trial dates to benefit Trump. What I'm choosing to think is instead is just based on the facts I've seen is more relating to incompetence.
We'll disagree on that.
Yeah, we are happily going to agree to disagree. Big news also this week in the civil trial, New York State civil fraud trial. Trump was bailed out by a billionaire, $175 million bond. But the thing is, this isn't a win. The $500 million he owes, he still owes. The evidence that exists against him is still there. He didn't win the case. He didn't really win anything. All he basically did was come up with the money for an appeal bond. It doesn't change the material facts of the case. It doesn't change the trajectory of what the possible outcomes could be.
It delays this, and basically any delay that Trump gets is a huge win for him, because as long as he still has an opportunity to become president of the United States, which he obviously does have that opportunity, if he does become president, and this isn't settled yet, he'll have so much money because so much money will be given to him by innumerable billionaires that it's a win in that the alternative was a tremendous loss.
Yeah, look, we now know that mainly he's being afforded a lot of deference and courtesies because he is a former United States president, and also because the stakes are incredibly high given how divided this country is. These things are going to take time, so they are going to be delayed. So what I'm choosing to do, rather than focus on the thing that we already know is part of our reality, that these trials are not happening in the time frame that we Democrats and independents and moderate Republicans would like to see happen, they're going to happen. One's going to happen. The jury is being selected in the hush money trial next week. It's going to be about a 6-week trial. By the beginning of June, Donald Trump could be a convicted felon. That's the first domino. Other dominoes are going to fall. So here's an interesting fact. Since leaving office, Trump has spent $100 million on lawyers, averaging more than $90,000 a day. Isn't that incredible?
Yes.
None of it, by the way, paid for with his own money.
Normally, I would feel sorry because a lot of the people who are giving $5 and $10, you know, what people could do with that money to help themselves, to help their families, to help their communities.
Sure.
But I don't feel sorry. I feel angry.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's move on to number 3. There was a lot of stuff happening in Florida with regard to abortion and reproductive rights.
Because for 54 years, they were trying to get Roe v. Wade terminated, and I did it, and I'm proud to have done it.
In 2016, Donald Trump ran to overturn Roe v. Wade. Now, in 2024, he's running to pass a national ban on a woman's right to choose. I'm running to make Roe v. Wade the law of the land again, so women have a federal guarantee to the right to choose. Donald Trump doesn't trust women. I do. I'm Joe Biden.
So here's the thing. The Florida Supreme Court upheld the state's 6-week abortion ban. There was a 15-week ban signed in 2022, but the DeSantis 6-week ban takes effect in 30 days, and that was signed by him last year. But what they did also do was they're going to allow an amendment to enshrine abortion access on the November ballot. So voters, like they have in other states, in other red states, they will get to decide what's going to happen in their state. And if history repeats itself,
Let's make Florida blue again.
I mean, this literally, it's a longer shot, but this literally could flip that state blue.
It could. I can't speak for most women. I can only speak for myself. But like 6 weeks? Like, how do people know what's going on in 6 weeks? I don't even know what's happening. First of all, that's just ridiculous.
That's how long it takes me just to have sex.
Lucky,
It doesn't end for six. It doesn't end until
your
6 weeks.
Significant other. My goodness gracious.
I'm sorry, I meant 6 minutes. I got so confused. I get so confused with time.
How are you going to enforce a 6-week? How does this happen that quickly?
You're going down the logic road with Republicans?
Well, it's effectively a ban on abortion in the state. That's what it is.
Well, I guess Jen's question is 5 weeks or 6 weeks or 7 weeks. Who's going to tell? Who's going to know?
I just want to know.
Well, the issue,
how this is going. So
people don't even know they're pregnant.
Well,
I mean, it's just ridiculous.
the issue is that the clinics are not going to take a chance, and it'll probably make it so that they're not willing to take the legal risk of being arrested for doing almost any abortion, because that's what it's all about.
Well,
it's just to ban abortion by putting a limit on that's impossible to meet.
But we've seen that in Texas, so you're right. But the bigger news is that voters are going to decide this. And I believe Florida will flip eventually. Because look at what's happened since Dobbs and Roe was overturned. They can't win a fucking thing. They have lost everything for the last 7-8 years.
I believe there are 2 vulnerable Republican seats in 2 mixed districts.
Sure.
I believe that those are the big hopes from the Democratic side. This is a huge blow to women between now and what happens in November. You know, it's hard to know at 6 weeks what's going on. This is a complicated decision. Most women, whether they believe in abortion or not, take this very seriously. And again, I'm angry and frustrated.
Joe Biden's going to be hammering home with more ads like that, basically saying, Donald Trump and Republicans want to control your bodies. I'm Joe Biden, and I want you to have absolute autonomy over your bodies. That's the choice you need to make. All right, let's get to our winners and losers.
My loser, Netanyahu. Biden expressed conditional support of Israel to facilitate a different approach to the war. My winner, U.S. judges, for handing down verdicts that keep cases in Florida and Georgia moving forward.
My winner is Bidenomics this morning, as we have another month of job growths. This is the 39th straight month with 303,000 jobs added in March. And my loser would be the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, for violating their own rules of engagement, and that's what their own people said today, and killing 7 World Central Kitchen humanitarian workers in a targeted attack on their convoy.
My winner is New Democrat Network founder Simon Rosenberg, who accurately predicted there would be no red wave in the 2020 midterms, and who in a new New York Times story explains why President Biden will beat Trump in November, and Democrats need to basically chill the fuck out. My loser is billionaire Don Hankey, who bailed out Donald Trump with a $175 million bond. Trump doesn't need bailing out. He needs accountability and a jail cell. And then I have an honorable mention. Anybody who is suggesting or claiming that the IDF intentionally targeted the World Central Kitchen staffers, as opposed to it just being a horrible mistake, which they owned up to today. It's an unconscionable claim. Which brings us to the rant. This week, Israel's main opposition leader and National Unity Party leader Benny Gantz, a member of the emergency government's war cabinet and a retired Army general and former IDF head, called for early elections to be held in September. And he's right, as was U.S. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who last month called for immediate elections. It's time for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to go. Period. End of story. Netanyahu has led the country for roughly 19 out of the last 28 years, and during that period, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has rapidly deteriorated. And that's not to excuse the failure of the Palestinian side, with the incompetence, corruption, and or commitment to Israel's destruction over the past 55 years by, among others, Fatah, the PLO, the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas, and from Yasser Arafat to Mahmoud Abbas. Make no mistake, Netanyahu is Israel's Trump, a cruel, corrupt, self-serving grifter whose extreme incompetence was proven yet again, most recently with the country's failure to protect its citizens on October 7th from the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, and the astounding hours-long response time it took once the slaughter took place. That's because the government's military resources and focus has shifted to the West Bank, where Bibi's continued to push for more illegal settlements. And like Trump, he's facing massive legal and political challenges and is accused by many of using the war to distract from and delay looming prosecution over fraud, breach of trust, and corruption, which he calls, wait for it, a witch hunt. Additionally, his personal polling and popularity has cratered, and it appears Gantz and his party have enough votes to pull together a winning coalition to lead the country. And just like 2016 to 2020, when we wanted the world to separate America from the words and actions of Trump, we need to separate Israel from Netanyahu, because Israel and the Israeli people are better than Bibi, as evidenced by the continuing mass protests against him in Israel. They want him gone, and they want peace more than anyone. So let's be clear. We need to continue supporting Israel, a critical ally in a complicated, dangerous region of the world, because ultimately that serves America's needs. But we need to see Netanyahu removed from the political and military landscape. He is the absolute wrong person at this time in history to be prosecuting this war, which is an important and necessary war. Putting aside the many seemingly insurmountable obstacles to peace on the Palestinian side, there is definitely no path to peace as long as Donald Netanyahu's in charge. All right, let's bring out Ian Bremmer. He is a political scientist, Columbia University professor, and president and founder of geopolitical risk advisory firm Eurasia Group, and GZERO Media, which covers international affairs. He is the author of 11 books, including the New York Times bestsellers Us versus Them, The Failure of Globalism, and his latest book, The Power of Crisis, How Three Threats and Our Response Will Change the World. Ian serves as rapporteur of the UN High-Level Advisory Body on Artificial Intelligence and is the foreign affairs columnist and editor-at-large for Time magazine. He is the host of GZERO World with Ian Bremmer, a global affairs program that airs weekly on U.S. public television. Ian is also a frequent guest on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and many other news outlets globally. Ian, welcome into the back room.
Thanks, Andy. Happy to join you.
So I want to start off with some timely news. Today is the 75th anniversary of NATO. And I want to know, from your perspective, why is this alliance so important? But even more so, why is it so important today, given Putin and Russia's aggression and all the other issues that we're dealing with globally?
Look, it's the strongest alliance in the world. It's very durable. 1949, coming out of World War II, the United States was victorious with its allies. That fell apart very quickly when Czechoslovakia turned communist, and then when the Soviets blockaded Berlin, East Berlin, and suddenly we were at the beginning of what became a Cold War, and the Europeans needed protection. And the United States, it became very clear that it couldn't just be a European thing, that wasn't going to be adequate. Those countries were too small, they were too weak, they didn't have the military capabilities. The Americans stepped in and created the North American Treaty Organization, and that has stayed standing and has now expanded through very different kinds of global orders, through Soviet collapse, and now through Russian revanchism. The Europeans didn't think NATO was so important for the last couple decades. We called it a peace dividend. But of course, the Russians felt that they were humiliated. They were in serious decline. They blamed the United States for that, and to a degree, the Europeans. And now they are taking pieces of independent countries. Mm-hmm. And, if you're the United States, you're not all that worried about it. If you're Canada, you don't care that much. But if you're Poland, if you're a Nordic country, if you're a Baltic country, I assure you, this feels like an existential threat. It's bigger than climate change. It's bigger than artificial intelligence. It's bigger than what's happening in the Middle East. It's bigger than the refugee crisis. It is the single thing that exercises you, your political system, your citizens every day, is, will the Russians attack you? Mm-hmm. And indeed, it's one of the reasons Macron has come out so strongly in recent months is because he feels that the Russians are playing dirty inside his own country, mm-hmm. Paying citizens of Moldova to sort of spray paint sort of swastikas on synagogues and to facilitate hate and push disinformation that's undermining his own country, the fabric of democracy and pursuing chaos. There's a lot of that happening right now, and it feels far from the United States. If you're a NATO country, if you're a NATO member in Europe, this is a very, very big deal.
Well, it seems like there are a lot of people in this country that are concerned about Putin marching into a NATO country. What is your take on that? Do you think that is a likelihood at some point?
Trotsky had this quote, "You may not want war, but war sometimes wants you." Mm-hmm. So first of all, you can always have a mistake. Just a week ago from when we're taping, we had a large number of Russian missiles that went into Kiev and went into the Lviv, the latter on the western border of Ukraine, a city. And one of those missiles went through Polish airspace. Mm-hmm. That is a NATO country. That is obviously illegal. And NATO fighter jets, not just Polish, but also other countries, scrambled immediately in response. You can have a mistake. One thing that we know from watching Russia the last 2 years is Putin doesn't have that much transparency on the capacity of his own troops, both in terms of their failings in the early months, but also in terms of Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, turning directly on him. So mistakes can happen. We also saw just a few weeks ago when President Zelensky was in Odessa in Ukraine, he was visited by the Greek prime minister, a good friend of mine, Kyriakos Mitsotakis. And there was a Russian missile that hit Odessa only a few hundred meters from where those two men were standing. I doubt that Putin made that order, but it's wholly plausible that the people that made the order had no idea. And what happens if he had been killed? This would be immediately the most dangerous environment since 1962, since the Cuban Missile Crisis. I also think that if Trump were to become president and he turns off all aid to Ukraine, I think that Putin might easily want to test how much the United States is prepared to support, say, a Baltic country, not by sending in tanks, but it's easy to have a false flag where you've got a bomb, where some Russians in the northeast of Estonia are killed or injured, and then the Russians are called on to respond, and there's a paramilitary group, and they're asking for arms, and there's cyber attacks, and what happens? What does the Estonian government do? The Prime Minister Kaja Kallas is, again, someone I talk to a fair amount. She's very personally concerned about that scenario. She's not making this up. This is absolutely plausible. So, no, I don't think the Russians are on the precipice of invading a NATO country, not at all. But I think the reality that NATO could end up in a fight with Russia is real. That's not a World War III scenario. That's not like, nuclear weapons. It's not, the day after. But it is really, really dangerous, especially for frontline European states. Look, you got to remember, Andy, when Trump, there's always an outrage about Trump, right? So Trump, one of the more recent outrages about Trump is when he said, if you're not paying your 2%, if you're not paying your dues to NATO, then Russia can do whatever the hell they want. And everyone's hair was on fire, right? Now, let's keep in mind that everyone that is plausibly concerned about a Russian invasion of their country is paying a lot more than 2%. The frontline countries are all paying 3%, 4%, and they're stepping it up. Poland, the Baltic states, Finland, they're paying a lot. It's Canada that's spending 1.3%. It's Spain that's spending 1.2%. And I mean, if Trump is saying, hey, Putin, you want to invade Newfoundland, have at it. Is that really something that we're concerned about? No, it's precisely the fact that the Canadians don't care that is reflected not in their statements, but in the reality of what they choose not to allocate to their defense spending. That is the reality, and that's what Trump was calling out.
I mean, you're painting an ominous picture on several levels. On the one hand, you're sort of likening the area to a really dry forest where any one little match can set the whole thing ablaze. But also, when you talk about Trump, we know he's no fan of NATO. You're talking about a situation where Putin would test the mettle of the United States to see how willing it is to defend NATO allies. And if Trump is president, maybe we know what that answer would be. So all of those things together make for a very volatile situation in that region, no?
That's it. I understand why you'd say that. That seems overstated to me. A lot of dry tinder does not mean the whole thing goes up. I'm saying a lot of dry tinder because it is quite plausible to see accidents in an environment where we do have a proxy war going on between NATO providing all these forces for Ukraine and the Russians engaged in an active war in Ukraine. It's not going well for the Ukrainians. The Russians aren't feeling that defensive, but the Ukrainians are increasingly striking deep inside Russia. And so that environment, you could see mistakes. Now, when I say it's possible that the Russians might test Estonia, if it turns out the Americans are fully prepared to support Estonia, or the Europeans all band together well to defend Estonia, then Russia probably backs down. If it turns out the Americans don't care, then the Russians do more in Estonia and NATO gets weaker and more fragmented. But neither of those are World War III scenarios.
Right.
They're just much more problematic scenarios than the peace dividend that we thought we were all living with for the last 30 years. So, you know, I get part of the reason that this is less ominous is precisely because the Americans are less at threat. And that is, I mean, you say a lot of Americans support this. It's not a priority in terms of who people are voting for at all. The border is. The Middle East war is more so. And again, not because anyone thinks that's going to hit the U.S., but because it resonates more with Arab American populations, with Jewish American populations, with the far left, with the far right. So there's that. I mean, the future of American democracy resonates. Abortion resonates. I mean, there are a lot of things that do. Ukraine doesn't really resonate. It's not front page news. It's not a headline. I'm not asked much about it in the last few months at all, at least not by the Americans. If I'm talking to the Europeans, either their leaders or their media, then it's the top issue. But in the United States, certainly since October 7th, and really ever since Speaker McCarthy was forced out, I would say it's gotten very little attention in the United States because it's less of a priority. I hope that. I just want to make sure that you have full context.
Yeah. And when you're speaking to these folks overseas in the Baltics and Poland, is their concern more immediate or is it more in the future? Like, should Trump become president again?
I would say it's both. It's the more immediate insofar as they were really worried that you're not going to get any more money from the Americans for Ukraine. Now, the Ukrainians, it's not just about weapons, it's also about mobilization of troops. You may have seen the Ukrainians are now pushing for a reduction of the draft age, mobilization age from 27, which is quite high, to 25, in part because it's politically unpopular, in part because you need these men for the economy. So it's a strain either way, but they need additional people on the front line. So they're addressing that. And the 60 billion now looks much more likely to me from the United States in the coming weeks. And certainly Speaker Johnson is working with Republicans and Democrats in House and Senate to find a way to get that done. So I would say to the extent that happens, you'll see big sigh of relief from the Europeans. Okay, we've got a little bit of breathing room here. We've got some space, but still that doesn't take away the issue that if Biden wins again, no clarity that the U.S. will be able to continue this kind of support for 2025, 2026 going forward. And it's not like the war is over anytime soon. And Trump, who very recently, I think 3 weeks ago, invited Hungarian President Viktor Orban to Mar-a-Lago and told Orban, I will not give another penny to the Ukrainians, and that will require a ceasefire overnight. I mean, that is Trump's position. Mike Pompeo, who wants to be a part of the Trump administration, but notably hasn't yet publicly endorsed him, has been saying, no, we got to give a lot of money to Ukraine. This is really important. But most of the MAGA wing in Congress are saying, we really don't want to provide this support for Ukraine. Certainly, that is a panic button for the Europeans, for most Europeans, not all, but for most Europeans right now. And that's why you've got the French, the Poles, the United Kingdom working together, UK outside of the EU, but certainly working with those governments to try to come up with how do we guarantee that there's going to be more support, and how do we ensure that we don't lose powerful European countries like the Germans, for example, if Trump decides, I want to cut a deal with Putin? How do we keep a common and united European front? That's also why Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Commission, is talking about creating a European Defense Commissioner, so that there is a stronger common European defense, irrespective of what a U.S. president might or might not do in a future year.
And what do you think is at the root of the MAGA opposition to Ukraine and simultaneously its bizarre obsession with Putin?
Well, there's a lot to that. I mean, Trump personally wanted Zelensky to open an investigation into Hunter Biden and into his father. which Zelensky refused. And he famously threatened to withhold anti-tank Javelin missiles unless he did that, which clearly is, a breach of executive authority, given that Congress had already passed that legislation, that support. So, I mean, I think that Trump considers Zelensky a personal enemy on a domestic issue that mattered to him as a consequence of that. That's one point. Secondly, this war happened under Biden. So has the Gaza war. And, if you are Trump, you are the one that wanted to end the war in Afghanistan by cutting a deal with the Taliban. However misguided the actual nature of that deal, it did help to put an end to the longest standing and very misguided war that the Americans have ever fought. 20 years and trillions of dollars and enormous numbers of casualties, most importantly on the ground in Afghanistan. And so, I mean, the fact that Trump and team are saying no new wars under my presidency, new wars under everybody else's presidency. So, the fact that Russia did that and that Biden is providing support, and that support is not going to lead to a Ukraine win. That support is still likely to lead to a partition of Ukraine. I think that there is a lot of feeling on the part of the United States. Why are we doing so much to spend money around the world when you've not paid attention to me? Why are we sending the children of the poor Americans, the working class Americans? Why are we devastating American communities for Iraq and Vietnam and Afghanistan, and benefiting the military industrial complex? Why are we doing that when we're not taking care of our own people, our own border, our own fentanyl crisis? Why are we doing that? I think the average American has zero interest in supporting these wars. And I also think a lot of Americans, a lot of young Americans, look at the U.S. around the world and don't think the U.S. is a good guy. Don't think Americans are the good guys. Mm-hmm. They see what the U.S. is supporting in Israel vis-a-vis Gaza, and they say they're not the good guys. Mm-hmm. On Ukraine, the U.S. is on the right side of the fight, but frequently the U.S. is not seen.
Yeah. Well, that dates back to Vietnam, even.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. But I mean, the fact is, you now have someone who is running and saying, I'm going to end all of that. Right. And I think that is absolutely
right. But not for the reasons. But not for the reasons you're giving. He's saying it for the first reason you gave, which is this is all. I mean, it's terrifying that perhaps almost half the country has a very strong geopolitical position, which is almost 100% rooted in Donald Trump's insecurities and quest for vengeance, personally against Vladimir Zelensky. I mean, that's my opinion, but that's what it seems like to me.
I don't think that's fair. I mean, I agree that, I gave you that reason because it's absolutely a driver of Trump, but Trump's interest in unilateralism and isolationism, in terms of not getting Americans involved in other countries around the world, not having American troops, that is much, much broader and deeper than just Ukraine. That is absolutely, I mean, even with Iran, there were so many times when Trump's advisors were saying, you need to hit these guys back. They're doing all this stuff in the Middle East. And Trump was saying, why am I responsible for that? He didn't want to take steps against Iran that could get the Americans involved in a war that really antagonized the UAE, for example, at this time. Now, I'm not suggesting that I support that policy at all. Mm-hmm. I'm simply saying, look, I mean, like, I'm a wealthy guy. I started my own company. I mean, frankly, Trump was great for me economically and, all this other stuff, right? But I mean, my finding Trump unacceptable as a candidate has nothing to do with a desire to try to be clear-eyed about why lots of people do support a lot of his policies.
Yeah, I'm just saying, like, with him,
I get it.
He never really seems to ever have any genuine core beliefs. And I think we both know that if Zelensky went public tomorrow and said Trump's a great guy and a great leader, Trump would probably be on the phone to Mike Johnson in 5 minutes saying, give him $10 billion. Like that's at least the general perception of Trump, how he thinks, what he doesn't care about and what motivates him and drives him in virtually every decision of his quote unquote political life. But, we can agree to disagree on that.
Look, of course. I mean, the narcissism of Trump is unprecedented in a president, and is clearly a primary motivating factor. But to argue as if that's all that matters, I mean, he is a very savvy political operator who understands his brand, and he understands where his supporters are. And so the fact that he gets that his supporters deeply wanted him to, for example, appoint conservative justices, the fact that his supporters deeply wanted him to take care of the border, the fact that his supporters deeply wanted him to end wars and not have troops all over the place fighting. I mean, you could argue that he's only doing that for a transactional reason because it supports him being in power, but he still has a very deep reason to do that because that's where his support base is. So, I mean, there's much of a muchness in having this conversation, right? I think it's important to understand those structural drivers that there are. In other words, if Trump didn't exist, and if he died of a heart attack, and someone else became his MAGA replacement who was not at all a narcissist, that policy space, in my view, would absolutely be occupied by a person who could be principled on all of these issues and drive the same policies. And you and I would need to have that conversation. And then you wouldn't have your narcissist argument anymore, but we'd still be talking about this issue.
No, I think that's a valid point, but it just seems like he goes which way the wind blows. And even on a geopolitical stage with people like Kim Jong-un and Erdogan and others who a U.S. president should never saddle up to, but he does because they feed his need to feel important and the narcissism that you talk about. And from that stems a lot of his politics and his foreign policy, which is kind of terrifying.
He wanted to cozy up. He wanted to cozy up to Kim Jong-un, right? And they had a couple of summits. And they weren't well prepared, and they did lead to something. You got the freeze for freeze, which the Chinese and others were arguing for. Unfortunately, Trump did not discuss it with the South Koreans beforehand. They found out about it on the media, which was deeply embarrassing because Trump doesn't care about process at all. But the freeze for freeze was the Americans were going to stop joint exercises with the South Koreans. The North Koreans were going to stop testing ballistic missiles. That actually did ratchet down the tensions between the two countries. No sanctions were removed by the United States on North Korea, for example, none. And so it wasn't as if the U.S. gave away the store in any way. And then Biden comes in, no more willingness to engage with North Korea at a high level. The North Koreans are testing again. And the United States is saying they've got to denuclearize. What was Trump or was Biden's policy on North Korea actually more effective? On balance, if you held a gun to my head, I would say they both were ineffective, but Trump's was slightly more effective. Even though
was it Trump's
Trump was
policy,
initially driven by narcissism.
Was it Trump's policies? Because I remember during the Trump years, there was always a talk of there's what Trump says, and then there's what the U.S. government does, what the Defense Department does. And a lot of the times, the two didn't necessarily, they weren't cohesive on a day-to-day basis. And so we may have had more effective foreign policy on some level in certain places during his presidency, but I'm not convinced that that was because he was a great leader in that regard and driving those policies.
Again, I don't think he is not my cup of tea, and I think he should be in jail for what he's done specifically in Georgia on the elections. I don't think he should be allowed to run for office, same as Bolsonaro in Brazil, where that is playing out in that country. But look, we look at lots of presidents, and for other presidents, we don't always say, oh my God, was that him or was that like an effective like cabinet level decision that was made? We don't do that with Biden, even though he's over 80 years old and he's not able to drive every policy. We don't do that. We give him credit. But as someone who was watching this very carefully, I mean, I see wins under Trump that Trump clearly was responsible for. I would look at the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, which was a significant upgrade, a multilateral trade deal, with NAFTA that was increasingly broken and didn't reflect the economic trade that existed between the countries at the time. The Abraham Accords, which Trump and Jared Kushner absolutely drove, those were big wins that were driven by Trump. Remember, Trump's first trip outside the U.S. was to the Gulf states and to Israel. Very, very unusual, but was unique for him and allowed him the access to make his administration do that. The equivalent for Biden, probably the Japan-South Korea breakthrough, which Biden was, I would say, equally involved in as Trump was in the Abraham Accords, but most of the heavy lifting was done by other people. Now, there were other things that Trump did that are successes that Trump had nothing to do with. The South Korea trade agreement chorus, that wasn't particularly Trump. The Kenya trade agreement is the first bilateral trade agreement with the U.S. ever with an African state. I doubt Trump was even aware that was getting done, but it happened under him. I mean, there are a lot of other ones I can point to. I can, again, say the same thing with the Biden administration. So, look, I get the fact that you and I don't like him, but that is very different from having a knee-jerk reaction that everything that is done that is positive under Trump always must be something else because he is incarnate evil. I think that is a deeply unhelpful position to have. I think it's disrespectful of what his administration accomplished. And I also think it angers and antagonizes his supporters unnecessarily. So that is why I'm pushing back so strongly.
No, I get that, and I agree with some of that. I just, at the end of the day, I have a hard time thinking that he was sitting up in the White House at 2 a.m. like Bill Clinton with his aides poring over policy and trying to make carefully weighted decisions. Personally, I think he's a moron. I think he's one of the dumbest presidents we've ever had, and he probably had a bunch of people like Stephen Miller and others sticking shit in front of him. And based on whichever way the wind blew with his narcissism that day or night is how policy eventually got made. I mean, look, you're an expert in this area. It's hard for me to debate because you live this. You make a living from it. I'm a guy at home watching and trying to
help.
Make some sense of it.
I'm trying to help.
But I find it hard to believe that he was personally driving decisions based on any core belief system on foreign policy.
Look, he has core views that aren't just about narcissism. He has a core view that the United States is being taken advantage of by other countries, free riding all around the world. That's a core view.
But doesn't that tap into what we're seeing with his legal problems at home, where he is just the perpetual victim? A. B, there always has to be an enemy with Trump. There has to be someone that's out to get him, which he then uses to rally support among the other people who eventually become brainwashed into thinking that everything he says is true. Isn't it just all part of the same thing?
But sometimes he's right. My point is not, I mean, again, for you to say this is only narcissism and everything he thinks is wrong, the fact is that the United States was not paying any attention to Germany allowing their gas to be supplied less expensively by the Russians. It was Trump that pushed on that, even though he was, wanted a more transactional relationship with Putin. He was like, this is stupid, and we shouldn't allow it. And he and his administration pushed hard on that in a way that the Obama administration didn't really care. And I think that's meaningful. He was the one that was pushing much harder and saying the Europeans have said they're going to get to 2%. They're not doing it. And someone has to hit these guys. He was the one that said the Mexicans are allowing everyone to come across the border. We will tariff them so hard their head will spin unless they strengthen the southern Mexican border to stop people coming over illegally through Central America. He used that leverage. The Mexicans stood up and paid attention. They got it done. So look, the fact is that the willingness of Trump to use American power to get outcomes that are beneficial for the United States has frequently paid off in America's favor. It has also occasionally broken things and made things much more dangerous. But to argue that it's only about narcissism, it's never successful. That's the only thing that drives him. You're doing yourself. You're clearly a smart guy. I understand you're not a policy expert, but the reason I assume you want to have me on is not to beat me up and say that I'm wrong about everything. It's because you think that this expertise would be valuable in helping you and your listeners have a more balanced view. Not because you want to like Trump. Believe me, again, I think he should be in jail. But as a political scientist, and that, I mean, first and foremost, like, I've devoted my life to trying to understand how the world works. And I just think that it's more powerful and motivating. It's not okay to believe that the only reason that Trump has supporters is because he's brainwashed.
Just to clarify,
that's not true.
That's just to clarify. That's not what I'm saying. I think the biggest point I'm making is that I think there's a big distinction between Trump, the man, and the Trump administration. And I'm not so sure that the things that you're talking about, just in my opinion, that the things that were effective for the United States came more out of Trump and his vision than came out of other people's vision. And he, in his weakest states, in terms of his characteristics, went along with certain things. And we'll never know. We'll never know.
No, we will know, because we've actually heard from a lot of the people around him, some of whom hate him viscerally, and we know what drove some of those policies. And also, we know a lot of the interlocutors. I mean, you know, I some of them work for me, people from other countries that were engaged with his administration at the time. And I mean, like, I spoke with all of those leaders who were in the room with Trump at the time from the G20 and the G7. And believe me, some of those meetings were profoundly embarrassing, but some of those meetings directly with Trump actually moved the ball. So all I'm saying is, if you come at this from a literally Trump never does anything that's good or useful for the United States, and it's all because of his administration, that is provably and definably false. False. And I'm not saying that he is not he is absolutely an outlier in lots of things that are dangerous for U.S. society and globally, but it's not as black and white as you are making it out to be.
Okay. Fair enough. Let's talk about Israel. I want to ask you, because there's just, I mean, if you and I were talking last week, we would have so much to talk about, but so much seems to have happened in just the last week. Where do you see the latest developments with the disastrous deaths with the World Central Kitchen volunteers, with the protests that are ongoing, with the dissatisfaction with Netanyahu, with Schumer's call for elections, with Benny Gantz coming out this week calling for an election in September? Where do you see things going forward, short term and long term?
Andy, you just raised so much. I mean, it's hard to even know where to start. This is well, first of all, let's understand that, I mean, again, Netanyahu, in my view, has done enormous damage to Israel's democracy at home, and he's done enormous damage to Israel's position internationally, and he needs to go. That's very clear, and a strong majority of the Israeli people agree with that view, and clearly so does the rest of the world. But it is also true that the war in Gaza and the number of civilian casualties attached to that, which is really staggering, is broadly supported by the war cabinet and by the Israeli population at large. They believe that this war is necessary and that the casualties, the civilian casualties, are an acceptable, necessary outcome of continuing the war and destroying Hamas. I do not agree with that, but they do. And so removing Netanyahu, getting a new government in, that doesn't change that view. And that view is at odds with the view of virtually every other country in the world. This also happens to be the view of the people of America's strongest ally in the Middle East. So you can see why this is a serious problem, right? It's a serious problem. The Israelis have become radicalized after October 7th. With terrorist attacks that were many, many times worse for them than 9/11 was in the United States, and with civilian hostages that have been, many of whom have been tortured, that continue to be held by Hamas to this day, and with a Palestinian population that a majority of whom supports Hamas as the legitimate governing institution for Palestinians. And they feel that way not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. And remember, this is an organization, it's a terrorist organization that does not recognize the right of Israel to exist and targets civilians. So that's the Israeli side of the equation. Now you look at the Palestinian side of the equation. 33,000 Palestinians are dead. The Israelis say you can't use those numbers because they're Hamas numbers. Actually, the US government also says those numbers are probably an undercount. Okay, so they are the numbers. And at least 60% of those are civilians. At least 10,000 of them are children. And the Israeli policy is to absolutely, you're targeting military targets, but even low-level military targets, the Israeli tolerance for civilian casualties in order to get those targets is staggeringly high, higher than the Americans would ever tolerate, than the Europeans would, in today's world, would ever tolerate. And that is a serious problem. And the Israelis keep telling the Americans and the Brits and the French and the Germans that they're going to be more careful. They're sorry. They're not. This is their policy. And the only reason they apologized for the World Central Kitchen is because it's a bunch of white folks that got killed, that led by, in an organization led by a celebrity in the United States with a lot of bipartisan support. Cindy McCain was saying the same thing about the World Food Program, and but it was Palestinians that were mostly killed, and they didn't do anything. And this has been going on all the way through the war. And there is no intention of ending this war anytime soon because the Israeli government, the war cabinet, feels like they need to take out Hamas leadership and military capacity in tunnels, and that includes on the ground in Rafah. So, I mean, we've got a very, very serious problem here.
So, and I agree with all of that. What are the alternatives? Given what you've said, given that what we all know about Hamas using its own people as human shields, operating out of schools and hospitals, etc., if the enemy puts itself there, what are Israel's choices? What are the alternatives to destroy Hamas if it's not to do what it's doing now?
That's a great question. So there's two different sorts of answers to that, two different mindsets to that, right? One mindset is that for all of the civilians that are getting killed, you cannot tell me that the Israelis are solely responsible. Hamas clearly has responsibility, much responsibility, for the civilians that are getting killed because they are operating in schools and under schools. They're operating in hospitals and under hospitals. They are using human shields. They do not respect the lives of their own civilians. And so this is a despicable practice, and they are clearly accountable as a consequence for the fact that they are putting their civilians in harm's way. That's one mindset that we all need to keep in mind. Mm-hmm. There's a second mindset that we need to keep in mind at the same time, which is that Israel has one of the most advanced militaries in the world. They are the strongest military overwhelmingly in the Middle East. They have nuclear weapons. They have incredible intelligence on the 75 square miles that is Gaza. They have military shields that can protect their population. And they have incredible pinpoint weaponry with AI that's driving it. Israel does not face an existential threat from Hamas, not even close. The reason Hamas did what they did on October 7th is because the leadership of Israel took their eye off the ball and took the IDF away from Gaza and put them into the West Bank because they were taking more land illegally and they were dealing with the reprisals that came from Palestinians in the West Bank as a consequence of that. That is not Hamas's responsibility. That is Israel's responsibility. And so Israel, as by far the more powerful country, has the ability and the obligation to be much more careful and much more targeted in how they choose to pursue the war, right? I mean, if you're Hamas, you don't have smart weapons. You've got dumb rockets that you launch all the time, and most of the time you have no idea what you're going to hit. Most of the time they're not going to hit anything, right? If you're Israel, you have the ability to pinpoint and you can take out all three of the convoy vehicles of the World Central Kitchen and know exactly what they are and kill and know exactly how many civilians you're going to kill because you want to make sure you get that one terrorist that has arms, low level, that's in one of those three cars, right? Now, I'm sorry, but you cannot tell me those are the same things. And you have to keep both of those things in your head constantly at the same time if you want to answer your question. You can't just hold one of them in your head. Is that fair to you?
I think it's a very complicated, nuanced situation because you talk
So it's
about
not as-
you talked about, which I believed up until October 7th, you talk about the strength and the expertise of the IDF. Yet the biggest thing that shocked the shit out of Israelis today is that they don't think that anymore. They thought that prior to October 7th. So we see how porous Israel was when Hamas needed it to be. And so if Israel really is, if you believe in never again, which Jews, which I am one, have heard and believed for decades now, then never again has to mean never again. And what does that mean in real tangible terms? How do you protect your country? How do you protect your citizens if the enemy is ensconced the way we've been talking about amongst the civilian population? And so while no one wants to see the kind of death that has been happening, the destruction that's been caused, all of that is awful. But the question then is still, what are the military options? Clearly, if you're talking about Israel's failure with the World Central Kitchen deaths, then the pinpointing, maybe it isn't as great. Maybe there's just mistakes. It's collateral damage. I mean, what do you say to the people that say war is ugly? It's ugly because people die, because innocent people die, and it's awful, which is why they should never be started.
Yeah.
Because that's the reality. I mean, innocent people die in every war. There's collateral damage. No one wants to see it. I agree with much of what you're saying in terms of the moral and the ethical need to be more careful and exercise more restraint. I just, for the last several months, have been at a loss as to how does Israel accomplish the ultimate goal if this is the militaristic landscape they have. You know,
first of all, I mean, Hamas is going to end up, or whatever you want to call it. It might not be called Hamas; it'll be something else. But radical anti-Israeli sentiment is going to go way up on the back of what's happened over the last 6 months. So clearly, if what the Israelis are trying to do is ensure that Israel is safe for generations of Jews, which I think is a very reasonable goal to have, they have the right to defend themselves. They are not going about it very well. I also think that never again does not only apply to Jews. Never again applies to people around the world. We saw what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust, and we collectively said this can never be allowed to happen again anywhere. And we just saw, my mother's was Armenian, 120,000 Armenians ethnically cleansed from the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh by Azerbaijan as Russian peacekeepers stood by and did nothing. And no one said boo. No one said boo. And that territory has been removed of Armenians, many of whom had lived there for generations and generations, and their churches were blown up and desecrated, and their cemeteries and everything else. And the Palestinians, I mean, Israel is not porous. Gaza is porous, okay? I mean, you've got 1.5 million Palestinians living in Rafah in conditions that are utterly inhumane. And there is, we say never again, it's happening to them right now.
Sure.
That's utterly unacceptable. And the Americans and the Brits and the French and the Germans are standing by and allowing that to happen. Israel has every right to defend itself. The U.S. has been a staunch and stalwart friend to help the Israelis defend themselves. That's why they get $3.8 billion from the U.S. every year. That's why they have Patriot defense systems. That's why the U.S. provides intelligence to the Israelis in real time. I support that. But the Palestinians need to be able to defend themselves too, and they do not have. And it doesn't mean that Hamas gets to have a police system. I mean, clearly that is not the case. It needs to be, Egyptians, UN peacekeepers, whatever. But right now, the Palestinians have no ability to defend themselves, none whatsoever. And what's happening today, these are clearly war crimes. These are clearly war crimes. And we need to do something about this collectively, because Netanyahu is doing his damnedest to destroy Israel. I honestly do not believe, if you are a friend of Israel today, you cannot be a friend of Netanyahu. You cannot be supporting him. And the Americans have done a huge disservice to their best friend in the Middle East by supporting him and his policies.
I totally agree on that. And we'll have to end on that. But I literally could talk to you for 3 hours. I have so many questions that I didn't get to.
Thank you, dude.
And hopefully that means you'll have to come back and continue this conversation. I do appreciate,
it's nice talking to you, man.
coming in and sharing a perspective that I do think is important.
Sure.
Alrighty. Take care. Bye. This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-edited and co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg, and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. Our theme song was composed by Andrew Hollander, and our logo was designed by Cricket Langell. And special thanks to Patricia Wind. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and have a great week.